All right, guys, our notes, chapter 1, section 1. So our whole class this year is all about earth science, and our first chapter kind of gives us some introductory topics for earth science. When we take lecture notes, you want to make sure you write down all writing in red. Other words are optional, so if you feel like other things are important for you to write down, go ahead and write it down. But if it's in red, that is what I require, that it's at the bare minimum. Those are things that are graded. So your notes are graded every time we take a test. For this year, being in our model that we're in, I will probably be grading them on a more regular basis. So you need to make sure you're taking those notes, make sure that I can read them. When you see vocabulary terms come up, make sure that you underline them. If you have headings that come up, like you see on this page here, make those a little bit bigger. Your notebook is a resource for you to use. So you want to make sure that you can easily look back and then find things. That's going to especially help you if you have to take a review quiz or when we take tests. So I can see on this page here, it says Chapter 1, Science is Everywhere, and then also in red, 1.1, Learning About Science. So for both of these things, you want to write down those two items in your notebook first, and because they are a heading, you want to make sure you're going to write them a little bit bigger, or maybe you can write them in the middle of the page, just something that you can easily come back and see those things if you want to. I have had students in the past take out a highlighter too, so they will highlight headings and they'll also highlight vocabulary terms, so that's another option for you. So Chapter 1, Science is Everywhere. In Section 1, we're going to be reviewing a little bit about learning about science. In Section 2, sort of some basic fundamentals of the scientific process, and then later on in the chapter, Section 3, we're going to be talking about the scientific method. Science is an orderly way of answering questions, is really all it is. So when you look at anything in our world, if you can ask a question, something as simple as why are plants green, that starts the scientific process moving. Maybe you notice that you see plants that are alive are green, while dead plants usually turn brown. Now that particular statement is called an inference. So an inference is a statement based on your experience. And notice it's italicized, your. So think about things that happen in life to you where they've happened in the past, so you have a really good prediction that it's going to happen in the future, or you're noticing a pattern, and those things are called inferences. So inferences are statements based on your experience. So these two things, asking questions, making inferences, they're a really basic part of science. Every part of science, even something as simple as looking up in the sky and seeing stars twinkling. Why are those stars twinkling? Why is that star twinkling a different color? Why does that star appear red? That star appear blue? All of those things are part of the scientific process, and people have answered those questions. So science is an orderly process for answering questions, and it always starts with that observation. Like I just said, I noticed these stars are blue and the star maybe burns a different color. So the scientific process, which is an orderly process for answering questions, starts with observations. Let's say I'm out in my garden, I notice bees move from flower to flower in my garden or in a field. That's an observation. Maybe I also notice this summer there appears to be less bees than I normally would see in the field. I'm thinking that. Maybe there's less. So those are just observations that I make to get started. Then I could ask a question. Are there maybe less bees in the United States right now? I can make an educated guess to that then, and that would be considered a hypothesis. So an educated guess to that question. So if I made an educated guess that said, there are less bees in the United States, would that fully be an educated guess? Maybe I should do a little research first, start looking at some data from different states, then I could maybe make a hypothesis. So it's important when you make a hypothesis, it's not random. It should be based on information, educated guess to a question. And you'll notice when I stated that hypothesis, it's stated like factual information. There are less bees in the United States. You don't write, I think, you don't write, I know. There's nothing about that in there. It's just simply a statement. I'm going to make a guess to that statement, and there is my guess. There are less bees in the United States. Educated guess to a question is a hypothesis. So what's it like to be a scientist? Jacques Cousteau, a very famous marine biologist, described a scientist as a curious person who looks through a keyhole. So what does he mean by that? Now, we don't have locks like this in our homes anymore, but we used to. And it's very similar to if you've ever seen the movie Alice in Wonderland. When you look through that keyhole, you can't see everything. You can only see part of it. Just like in Alice in Wonderland, she could only see part of what was on the other side of that keyhole. Scientists, think about why that would be like the same thing for a scientist. You can see part of it, but you can't see the whole picture. So it's just like going back to that star analogy. I can see those stars, but I don't fully see everything, so I don't know why. Or even my bee example. I can see what's happening here in my field, but I don't know what's happening everywhere in the United States. So an experiment, when we do an experiment, then it's trying to get a bigger picture of what's going on the other side of the keyhole. You only see part of the room, not the whole picture at once. So we perform experiments in science to test a hypothesis, is really all it is. I want to now get a bigger picture of what's going on the other side of the keyhole, and I can only do so by performing an experiment. So an activity performed that tests a hypothesis is an experiment. Think about doing that in my yard with my bees. Do I have the ability to, in my yard, possibly set up a scientific experiment where I could maybe take a portion of a field and then measure the number of bees that I have there and then compare that to another period of time? That would be an experiment. So an experiment is a tool that scientists use just to see the rest of the room. So scientists are curious. They enjoy solving problems. So if you feel like, hey, I really like answering questions, maybe you can be a scientist someday. And it doesn't necessarily always mean you're going to be a formal scientist and you're going to be working in a lab coat and doing a job, because not all scientists wear lab coats. We have scientists everywhere in the world that are outside. Yes, some are in labs. They're everywhere answering these questions. So it's not always necessarily I'm in a lab performing experiments. I can be outside doing things. I can be in a myriad of places, and I can be a scientist as long as I answer questions. So we have different fields of science. Every one of these use the scientific method. So here's some major fields of science. We have physics, which is the study of matter and how it moves. We have chemistry, which is a study of matter, but on a molecular level. How does it interact with each other? Biology, which is the study of life, because the prefix bio means life. So when you take biology someday, it's studying things like cells and animals and plants. Astronomy, that's the field of science for essentially everything beyond Earth. So now go beyond Earth and study the stars and the sun and the planets. That's the field of astronomy. Earth science is what we're doing this year, just what its name implies, studying Earth, so everything on Earth that isn't alive. Ecology is also studying life, but ecology is more studying how life interacts with each other. So imagine studying maybe white-tailed deer in the state of Minnesota, and you're trying to study how the white-tailed deer population maybe interacts with something else. That's the field of ecology. So it's how life interacts with each other. So you're going to find as you go through school here, maybe one field of science is more interesting to you than another. Me being a science teacher, I love them all. I all think they're just really cool because every one of these essentially explains how our world works. And that's the reason I love science. So we use science every day. So even if you aren't going to become a scientist someday, what science does for you in any of your classes that you guys have in school, it helps explain things to you, why things are the way they are. Even from using something like toothpaste in the morning, a scientist developed whatever the formula was for that toothpaste to make it so that it cleaned your teeth the best and prevented cavities. When you use a pencil at school, even if it's a mechanical pencil, there was science involved in every aspect of that. From the time you get up to the time you go to bed, science is involved in so many things that we do. Even just think of your phone. The science that was involved getting that phone to you in your hand to essentially be a handheld computer, which it is. All right, so that is 1.1, and we're going to combine these with 1.2 because they're two pretty short sections here. So 1.2 is now about making observations, so observing the world. 1.2, observing the world. So an observation is an accurate description of a thing or event. Notice we have the word accurate in there. What does that mean to you? Accurate. It's factual. There's no opinions in that. If we look at the picture here, an accurate description. Think of some of the things that you could talk about. Accurate descriptions. The boy jumped off the board there. There is a tree in the background. There is a cloud in the sky. There's an orange fish in the water. Those are all accurate descriptions. If I start saying things like, that's a pretty tree, that fish is big, that boy's having fun, those are no longer observations. I'm now starting to get into what we call opinions. So observations are accurate description of a thing or event. The sky is blue is an observation. So make sure an observation is factual. It is raining. It is not an opinion. Observations are not opinions. That is someone's personal thoughts. I like rain. That's not an observation. Opinions are someone's personal thoughts. And in terms of science, science rarely ever talks about opinions. We don't have opinions in science. We collect data, we present facts. That is what science is. Someone can look at that data, someone can look at those facts, they can make opinions off of that, but that is not what a scientist does. They look at trends in data, they look at what's happening. No opinions in science. When we make observations, it's very important to make sure you use all of your senses. So each of your senses are valuable in making observations. We often go to seeing. Number one, seeing. That's really easy. I see it. Great. But make sure we include other things. Do you hear something? Like we did with the candle on the first day in class. Like we were talking about, you could hear the wick kind of moving back and forth. If you touch something, is it smooth? Is it rough? How about temperature? Does it feel hot? Does it feel cold? Now, we don't often do tasting in science class, but it does sometimes come up. But if we did, you could include that. Smell. Does it smell like a certain thing? Does it smell like, often a lot of things in science will smell like rotten eggs, like when you light a match. Does it smell like rotten eggs? Does it have a sweet smell? Does it have a sour smell? So make sure when you are making observations, we try to use all of our senses if possible. When you make observations, you're trying to give information to someone else that isn't there. It's kind of like retelling a story to someone. If you went somewhere to something and they said, hey, you took a trip to the aquarium, what was it like? Oh, it was neat. No, we need to get further in depth with that. You want to make sure that someone who's not there can get a very accurate description of the things that you saw or the things that you heard, touched, tasted, or smelled, so that they essentially have all of that information as well. When we record observations, we do that in a notebook or a lab report. We use scientific notebooks or we use lab reports in class, and it's just you having a written record of that experiment. The scientific process helps you know what to write, and we're going to go through that in the next chapter. This is an example of a data table, so this would be me writing data down. Actually, when we do data tables, if you make an error, we never erase it. You just draw a line through it. That was that person's way of saying, I made a mistake, but here it is. So mistakes are okay in lab notebooks. It's just nice because now I can see what's there. Because remember, science is facts. You should never take information, erase it, put new stuff in there because you are changing information. Scientists do not change information. If I accidentally make a mistake when I write it, you just draw a line through it. Mistakes are okay in notebooks. And just like when we're taking lecture notes, same thing, mistakes are okay. When you do scientific experiments, you do all of these things like write down observations, all of them, you write down data so that you can take this and repeat it. If my experiment can be repeated by someone else, that's a great thing in science because the more and more and more you repeat it and other people repeat it, the more it becomes scientific fact. If I can't repeat something more than once, then it is not scientific fact. Here's an example of Thomas Edison's notebook page. He was developed the light bulb, the incandescent light bulb that we currently use. That's going to be getting phased out in the near future, but he used that and he was a scientist essentially. So he wrote down very good information in a notebook so that that information could be repeated. So we use lots of tools as scientists. Not only do we use notebooks, we take and use all of these tools that you see on the right-hand side here also to do our experiments. And we're going to get into those when we do measuring stuff. All right, so that is section 1.1 and 1.2 notes. So after you are done with these, you're going to want to make sure to submit those for an assignment.